am very happy to have Julianne or Jules Appleton from First Book. And Jules has a wealth of experience and over a decade of experience working in this field. And she has held multiple roles for user experience to data-driven marketing, and most recently, research and data storytelling. In her role as Director of Research and Insights, she manages First Book's primary research initiatives, which range from interviews and focus groups to more robust quantitative surveys and longitudinal studies about banned books and why they're happening not only in certain states, but all across the world. Jules has a passion for educational equity and equality and the use of data to improve the educational experiences for children in low and marginalized communities. She holds a master's of administration in intercultural service, leadership, and management from the School of International Training. And we are so happy to have you today, Jules, and to have your presentation. And so we are excited that you're here, and we're excited for you to go forth and have your presentation.
First of all, thank you all for having me today. My name is Jules Appleton. I am Director of Research and Insights at First Book. And before we dive into the studies that I am going to be talking about today, I want to take about 60 seconds just to explain First Book and what we do, and then I'll dive into the goods. So First Book's mission is to further educational equity. Our work starts with a network of more than 575,000 educators, all of whom serve children in under-resourced communities. Once connected with First Book, these educators get access to the First Book Marketplace, which is our e-commerce site that provides educators with access to the books and resources they need for free and at the lowest prices possible. These educators also get connected to tons of other free opportunities through First Book, like virtual reading parties, grant opportunities, and the chance to participate in research. Which brings us to the reason I'm here today with all of you. So First Book Research and Insights conducts as many as 30 studies annually, and they range from focus groups to large-scale surveys. Our goal as a research team is to elevate educators' voice into the national and regional dialogues on critical education issues. Today, I am walking you through the findings from First Book's Banned Books Survey and Diverse Books Impact Study. So these are two separate studies, but their subject matter does overlap significantly. So while we all understand that diverse books and banned books are not synonymous, we also know they aren't unrelated. We're presenting these results together so that you can get the most comprehensive picture of some of the challenges educators are facing right now when it comes to inspiring young readers. So I'm going to start today by discussing the findings from our Banned Books Survey. One very important note on this survey was that we very specifically asked educators about their feelings and experiences with the national dialogue around banned books. So the survey was not focused on what happens when educators are forced to remove books from their classroom libraries, but it was more focused on how this very intense public dialogue around banned books is impacting teachers, students, and education in general. So with that, let's take a look at what we learned. We'll start out with our key findings first to give you an idea of the main takeaways from this study so that you can keep these findings in mind as I move through the detailed data. So from our Banned Books Survey, we learned that 1/3 of educators in the First Book network are facing book bans, challenges, or policy restrictions. However, nearly all educators believe that books should rarely or never be banned. We learned that educators feel undermined, disrespected, and distrusted to do their jobs, and that a lot of teachers are scared for the future of education and sometimes even for themselves. We saw that educators are again feeling the effects of being left out of a critical national education conversation, when in fact they are the trained professionals in this space. And we see this sentiment come up a lot in our research that educators feel left out of these important conversations. And lastly, we learned that some educators are leaning in and buying more banned books in response to this public conversation, while others stop buying books altogether for fear of wasting their money if books end up being banned or removed. let's dive in. This is a quick look at our methodology for this survey. So we don't need to spend a lot of time here. Just know that this survey went out in April of this year, and we received just over 1,500 completed survey responses. So first, we wanted to get a feel for what kinds of book restrictions, if any, our educators are currently facing. We learned that 40% of First Book members are not facing any book restrictions. 29% were unsure or reported some sort of unique situation that didn't necessarily fit one of the answer options. And then we had 31% say yes, there have been book bans, challenges, or restrictions at my school. So for those 1/3 of educators who are facing book restrictions, you can turn your attention to the chart on the right to see the breakdown of what those restrictions are. So 18% say specific titles have been challenged but not banned. 10% say their school has policies about themes of books that aren't allowed, and 11% are at schools where specific titles have in fact been banned. All right, so the next 3 slides tell a bit of a combined story, so hang on with me through the next 3 slides. First, we wanted to know if our educators had already removed any books from their personal classroom libraries, either because they were worried that they might be challenged, banned, or incite backlash, or because they were actually banned. And you can see that largely the answer is no. Over 70% of educators say they have not removed any books from their classroom. However, that doesn't mean that the public attention on banned books right now isn't affecting their teaching. So while educators for the most part are not removing books from their libraries, many are changing the way they shop for books and teach. So you can see 46% of educators report that the conversation around banned books already does or might influence the titles they choose for their class. And 37% report that the conversation around banned books already does or might influence the way they teach. So we're seeing that this conversation is having a chilling effect on educators beyond just the districts that are seeing the book bans. So let's dig a little deeper here and see how exactly it is affecting educators. Before I jump into what some of these changes in educator behavior are, let me pause and just explain the layout of the upcoming slides. So on the next few slides, we're going to be reviewing qualitative data that came in through open-ended responses. You'll see responses grouped by theme, showing you the most prevalent common themes to come out of a response set. The numbers in the bubbles represent the percent of responses to a question that touched on a given theme. The responses may touch on multiple themes, so therefore these percents are not going to add up to 100. So it's just a little bit of how you digest this slide. So for all the educators who said that they are or might change their teaching in response to the public attention on banned books, we wanted to ask how and why. In what ways have educators changed their classroom library, their shopping behaviors, or their teaching in response to the dialogue around banned books? The major themes that came from these responses were, first and foremost, some educators are buying fewer books, distributing books less often or under more controlled circumstances, and being more selective with the titles they purchase for their classroom. So educators are looking to protect themselves. And this theme represents about 77% of responses. You can see some of the powerful quotes here from educator respondents that really demonstrate this finding. One educator says, "I no longer purchase books that have been banned or challenged because I worry I am wasting my money." Or, "I have stopped giving any and all books to students in my program because of fear around state laws." The next major theme to come from this question was that some educators lean in and buy more banned books. So they're doing the opposite. And most commonly, educators said that they're leaning in and buying more banned books because they don't ever want to restrict access to information for their students, or they don't want any students to feel unseen or unimportant, or quite simply, they know that the books their students want to read are the more likely to be challenged ones. So you can see some more key supporting quotes here from educators in the purple box. So because of books being banned, I've gone out of my way to have controversial books available in my classroom. If I can make even one child feel more comfortable or seen, then it's all worth it. I'm going to pause for a quick detour here. So you might wonder how both of these things can be true. 77% of responses talk about being more selective in their book purchasing and the access that they provide their students. And 48% of responses touched on buying more banned books and ensuring greater access to challenge content. So in what situations might these things overlap? The most common example was educators being more selective in what they make openly accessible in the classroom versus what is available under controlled access. So some educators are still buying those books that they know will be most impactful for their students, but they are also keeping certain titles under their control to distribute. And the most common reason for this was that educators want to always remain respectful of families' requests when it comes to what their children can have access to. But that doesn't mean that they remove controversial books altogether. They are selective in which students get access to which titles. Another common overlap situation is educators who serve all ages. They may limit title access for younger ages, but not older ages. All right, moving on. So the third most common way that educators are changing their teaching because of banned books is using the topic as a teaching moment. So about 44% of respondents spoke about empowering students with knowledge and free choice and open conversation about banned books. They're using this moment in time to educate and empower students. Some educators even turned it into a lesson, like this educator represented in the green box, who, with support from their administration, teaches about the freedom to read. And lastly, we saw about 25% of our educators say that because of this national dialogue around banned books, they're simply adhering to the restrictions in place for fear of jeopardizing their jobs. This educator says, "I censor in a way I don't believe in based on fear of my upper administration." So we know now on the individual educator level how the banned books conversation is impacting their work, but let's zoom out. How do educators see book banning impacting teaching in the grand scheme of things, regardless of whether they have changed their actual teaching practices? This was another open-ended qualitative question. So we relied heavily on open-ended qualitative data in the survey to really allow educators the freedom to speak on this topic in their own words, instead of having to try and fit their thoughts on such a complex and nuanced topic into predetermined responses. So we very intentionally used a lot of open-ended feedback in this survey. So from this question, how does book banning impact teaching, whether negatively or positively? We learned that first and foremost, educators feel like their expertise is being undermined and they are not trusted to do the job that they are so passionate about and have worked so hard to be experts at. One educator says, "Banning books negatively impacts teaching because it limits instruction, learning, and inquiry." And another educator says the impact is more psychological, having a muzzling effect. No one wants to be the first person targeted. Second major finding, educators believe that banning books erases people and history. Representation matters and book banning devalues it. This educator says, "Banning books attempts to delete history and people. I would never want to hide reality from my students." The third major theme to come from this question was that banning books discourages critical thinking and students should feel empowered to learn. This educator says, the banning of books tells students they cannot be trusted with information. And lastly, the fourth major finding, a smaller percentage of responses suggested that book banning isn't always bad. And this was largely related to younger students, where teachers felt that certain topics like sexuality or violence were not necessary or appropriate for younger ages and may be more distracting than educational. So another question that we wanted to ask our educators and allow for free response to was, have you observed any noteworthy changes in student engagement or learning, either positive or negative, in relation to banned or challenged books? And what we learned was that students are reading more when given access to banned books and free choice reading. This response was about 78% of our audience. And this qualitative finding is really key because it touches on the powerful combination of student choice and access to titles with diverse representation. So it's not one or the other. It's knowing that students will be more excited if they get control over what they read. And as you'll see later in our diverse book study, what they want to read is diverse books that feature characters and storylines that reflect their own realities and their own lived experiences. Additionally, students become more intrigued in something when they are told they cannot know about it. So these banned books become really appealing.
No.
This educator says, my students actively seek out books that have been challenged in other places. They know that people are banning the good stuff.
You know what? Go to the room with the other crime. With the crime. You gonna
The
stop?
second common theme is along the same line. So many educators pointed out that getting students engaged in reading is hard enough as it is, and restricting book access in any way only further limits engagement. So one educator says not having access to banned books means only less engaging books are available. And lastly, a smaller but notable percentage of educators pointed out that family opinion impacts a student's learning journey. This educator represented here tells the story of a child who is not allowed to join the class in the library because there are LGBTQ books available. But the educator pointed out that this child isn't just being shielded from the content in those specific titles, but is also being shielded from other learning opportunities like developing research skills and identifying credible sources, the poetry unit, and just the general joys of being in a library and being able to check out books. All right, so at the end of every survey, we always like to ask our educators, is there anything else? We give them the space to leave any feedback related to the survey topic that they think First Book should know. 4 major themes emerged from educators' final thoughts on the topic of banned books. Number 1, first and foremost, educators want to make clear that the conversation around banned books and the resulting restrictions harm students. Banning books, particularly the books currently being banned, hinders student learning and especially harms minority groups. This educator says when we ban books, we're not only removing diversity and representation, we are telling key groups of kids that they are not worthy of being represented, that they don't matter, that they are invisible. Another educator says children seeing themselves in a wide variety of representation in books goes a long way to help them accept themselves and others for the rest of their lives. Second most common final thought on this topic is that educators also want to make clear that this conversation about banned books and the resulting book restrictions harm educators themselves as well. This current national dialogue around banned books discredits educators and instills fear. This educator says this conversation is causing animosity toward the profession. People don't want to become teachers. Another educator says the onslaught of destructive practices against education has made an already challenging and sometimes thankless profession into an excruciating, depressing, and sometimes terrifying and exhausting one. These acts are driving away some of the best educators. The third major finding to come from this final question was educators also want to remind us that banned books can, do, and should empower students. Knowledge is power, and students of all ages can benefit from being exposed to diverse content. The educator says, my students are annoyed at all the book challengers and district policies, and they beg me not to limit their selection of books. I listen to them. They are a smart generation. We need to trust them and guide them. Books encourage and promote independent and critical thinking, which empowers leaders in change. We are stifling children and limiting future leaders with these restrictive book bans. And lastly, the fourth major finding of about 43% of responses touched on the importance of the family role in all of this, mainly that families can have final say over what their own children learn and read, but they cannot control what others consume. So this educator says, I believe public schools serve entire communities, not just a group of people. Parents have the right to make choices for their child, but they do not have the right to make a choice for another student. All right. So now I'm going to pivot to a little bit more of an uplifting topic. First Books, Diverse Books Impact Study. Again, we tackled the topic of diverse books in a separate study because we don't want people to think of banned books and diverse books as the same thing. Diverse books are their own separate, powerful tool for helping students form identities and feel valued and seen, learn about the lives of others. And while many banned books are diverse books, it is not diverse books in and of themselves that are being challenged and banned. So what I want to do now is lift up the power of diverse books and the incredible impact they can have on students. So with that, First Books, Diverse Books Impact Study was a roughly 6-month longitudinal study that examined how educators build and curate diverse classroom libraries and how those diverse classroom libraries impact students and teachers. This was First Book's first longitudinal intervention-based study, which just means that data collection took place over time, and we were tracking the impact of a specific action. That action being the infusion of diverse books into a classroom. And we really hope that this is just the beginning of First Book producing some much needed true impact data for the field. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the need for this data in a few slides. So I'm going to review key findings again up top, so you can keep these in mind as we go through the details. What we learned from this study is students' reading scores increased after educators added diverse books to their classroom libraries. We saw that bilingual and LGBTQ+ titles drove the largest reading gains. We saw that students spent more time reading after educators added diverse books to their classroom libraries. So beyond just reading scores improving, reading engagement improved as well. And we saw that allowing students to choose which books they want to read positively affects outcomes, and that a majority of students choose to read diverse books that serve as mirrors where they can see themselves. Okay, I'm going to set the scene for you guys a little bit. What set First Book out to conduct this study? The information on this slide may not be new or shocking to anyone here, but I do think it's important just for context as I set the study up. So problem number one, the lack of access to books in low-income communities. First Book has always known that access to books for kids in low-income communities is limited. A study by early literacy researcher Susan Newman found that in the lowest income neighborhoods, there is often only one book for every 295 children. And this is compared to more affluent communities where there's typically one book for every 5 children. So access to any books at all is often the #1 priority for educators. But if you want to get kids excited about reading, you really need more than just any book. So what kinds of books do educators need? This brings us to problem number 2, the lack of diversity in children's books. Existing research has taught us all that diverse characters and cultures are just often not represented in children's books, even though 53% of school-age children are children of color. A 2022 review of nearly 3,500 children's titles revealed that the diversity represented in children's books simply does not reflect the diversity of readers. One of our first ever First Book network surveys taught us that 90% of our members said their students would be more enthusiastic readers if they had access to books with characters, stories, and images that reflect their lives. So in response to findings like these, along with ongoing research and endless anecdotal feedback from educators themselves about the importance of diverse books, First Book has been intentionally curating titles with diverse characters and cultures for our First Book marketplace for years. In 2022 alone, First Book members purchased over 2.5 million diverse books from the First Book marketplace. So we know these books are in high demand, but how do we know if these diverse books are actually making a difference in kids' lives? And what difference are they making? Data on the lack of and need for diverse children's books is well documented, but data on the impact of having access to diverse books is not. And that is how the Diverse Books Impact Study was born. So this study was designed with 3 objectives in mind. Objective 1, to better understand the impact of diverse classroom libraries from the educator perspective. Objective 2, to better understand the impact of diverse classroom libraries with respect to student outcomes. And objective 3, to add to the limited existing research on this topic. So I'm going to take a quick moment just to speak specifically to objective number 3. As I started mentioning before, there is existing research linking diverse books to student choice and reading engagement, and there's some research out there demonstrating that access to diverse books in the classroom and at home can result in greater self-confidence, empathy, and cultural awareness for children. However, a lot of this research was often conducted within a single classroom or with a very controlled sample size. First Book wants to start filling the gap in existing research for the education sector by leveraging the voices of our network of 575,000 educators and their experiences. So can First Book become a go-to source for providing quality data on the impact of diverse books for the field? Some much needed data. This is an overview of our study methodology, this very beautiful slide I will not spend too much time on. Just know that this study was conducted in 2 phases. Phase 1, we did a large-scale quantitative survey. So we started by just emailing our entire network, telling them that we were conducting a study where participants would be required to place an order of $250 fully paid for of diverse books, and then answer a series of regular surveys following receiving those books. We had a great response to this screener. So nearly 4,000 educators filled out the screener to participate, saying, yes, I would love to participate in the study. So there was exceptional interest, which is really promising. In the end, we selected nearly 600 educator participants and had 437 educators complete the study. We rounded out the study in phase 2 with interviews. We conducted 15 informal semi-structured interviews. All right, so first we wanted to establish some baseline measurements to help us understand how students interact with their teachers' current classroom libraries. Through a 5-point agreement scale, we learned that students are generally engaged in reading, but most excited to read books that reflect who they are. So you can see that 78% of our educators said their students were interested and enthusiastic about reading at the start of the study, with 70% indicating that their students more often choose books that serve as mirrors, compared to 41% who say their students more often choose books that serve as windows. And in the gold box to the right, you can see that we used the classic Bishop definitions of windows and mirrors, which are windows are books that allow children to see into the lives of those that are different from them, and mirrors are books that allow children to see themselves and their culture reflected back at them. Very first promising key finding from the study was that just 5 months after the infusion of diverse books into the classroom, the average amount of classroom reading time increased by 4 hours per week. So this means that the addition of approximately 48 diverse books, which is the average number of books participants were able to get through the study, the addition of just 48 diverse books through this study added 4 hours of collective reading each week to the classroom. Beyond just reading engagement, reading scores also improved for our participants. At each bi-monthly survey time point, educators reported gains in reading assessment scores. You can see that reflected in this chart to the right here. Now, of course, this would be expected in any classroom, that scores improve regardless of the infusion of new books. What's interesting is that the amount scores improved for participants in this study was far higher than the nationally expected yearly gains. So the NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, reports an average gain of 6 points in reading scores for a given year. Our participants saw gains of 9 points by the end of this study, so 3 points higher than the national average. Even more exciting, these gains were greatest for the lowest scoring students. So those students who stood to improve the most did. Next, we learned that 2 specific types of diverse titles drive even greater engagement and growth than others. Bilingual books had a significant impact on reading scores. For every 1 additional bilingual book that participants added to their libraries, their students' reading assessment scores improved by 7 points on average. Additionally, for every 1 LGBTQ+ book that educators added to their libraries, student reading scores improved by 4.5 points on average. And this was regardless of classroom makeup. So we did not ask educators to report on whether any of their students were part of the LGBTQ community. We saw these gains regardless. So this really helps us understand that there is a notable difference between giving students just any new book and giving them books that reflect their lived experiences. All right, so as you can see, we learned a lot from both these studies and saw some really promising results because of this work. We saw that $250 worth of diverse books can make a huge difference for student outcomes, and that educators are determined to not let the conversation around banned books impact their students' love of reading or their love of teaching. So we're clearly very excited to keep talking about these studies and these topics and get these results out to key groups in the education space and the children's book space. But we're also starting to look forward, ahead towards future research. So First Book is looking to continue this work, mainly repeating the diverse books impact study for a full school year. So we did face a couple study limitations that we'd ideally address in future study phases to just further validate and expand upon all these findings that you saw today. Additionally, as I mentioned before, future study phases would really be part of an ongoing effort to add some much needed data on the impact of diverse books to the field, data that simply does not exist at the scale that First Book can execute. And lastly, First Book Research and Insights will continue to conduct research among our educators in low-income communities to identify the challenges they face, help them overcome those challenges where we can, and share their stories far and wide to raise awareness and support for educators and the children they serve. So that is all I have from a data perspective for you guys today. You can find the full report for both of these studies on firstbook.org. I want to thank you all for listening. I really hope you got something useful out of this. And I believe I will turn it back to Ray for some Q&A.
Thanks so much, Jules. You definitely went through a very thorough deep dive into you all's research. And I want to go back to a few of the points you share with us this evening. The first one being, I had taken a few screenshots of some things that you had shared. I'm not going to share them out or anything like that, but I definitely want to talk about how did you get to what is your barrier for, well, first and foremost, let me back up. How did you get to a point of establishing what were under-resourced communities?
Excellent question. So First Book serves exclusively educators that work in under-resourced communities. And to be a member of the First Book community, you have to go through a registration process. And so part of that process involves confirming that you do in fact serve 70% or the children you serve are 70% or more of low-income backgrounds, or you work at a Title I or Title I eligible school. So there's a lot of different criteria that educators can use to prove that they do serve low-income populations, but that is taken care of through the First Book registration process.
And I do want to go to one of those slides where you showed that over 70% of educators have not removed or banned or banned or challenged books. And so what was that process like in collecting that data?
So we know the First Book, the members of the First Book network, we know are all very big advocates of diverse content, of banned books. So we had a feeling that those numbers would be pretty high. That we knew that our educators would not have removed that many books from their libraries, just given the nature of who our members are. But we leave it up to them to describe to us whether they are facing a policy challenge or ban, or whether they are choosing themselves to remove a book preemptively to protect themselves. And we did see a few instances of both those things happening, where more often than not, educators saying, I'm just going to be safe. My district hasn't actually told me I need to remove something yet, but I don't want to be the first person targeted. I don't want to become under attack. And some educators, unfortunately, also don't want to put themselves physically in danger, which is a possibility these days if you are providing access to a banned book that someone in your community might not approve of. So I might have diverted from your original question, but I hope I got to some of it there.
No, you did. You absolutely did. It leads me to my next question, which is that most students want to see characters that reflect their life and their lived experience and experiences of the people they interact with. And so how did that go into you all formulating the final thoughts on book bans from educators? Because I want to talk about this slide I got pulled up here that's got the 81%, the 78%, 63 and 43%, a little bit more, and do a deeper dive in that. But like, what does that look like? How did you create a formula for research to even think about all of those different aspects of folks' intersectional experiences?
So the wonderful and taxing thing about doing the banned book survey was that we did lean heavily on open-ended qualitative data. So I did not hypothesize any of these theories that came out of the study. I really left it open to educators, and these were the main things that came in through their open-ended responses, which just makes it really powerful, and it was really intentional because this is such a complex topic, and we didn't want to bias educators in any way based on the way we were asking questions. So we really let them organically tell us all their thoughts on this topic, and these were all the findings that bubbled to the top.
Awesome. I want to talk a little bit more about the concept of windows and mirrors. So I think that's really amazing because I think it has a lot to do with emotional intelligence and self-awareness and understanding of even maybe your ancestry or biases. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, windows and mirrors are really important at First Book. And, there's a third one. There's windows, mirrors, and what we call sliding glass doors, books that allow you to do both. Historically, I would say about 5 years or so, we actually saw more members in our network saying that their kids were that they were interested in providing books as windows for kids. They wanted a lot of books for kids to see into the lives of others. And now in recent years, we're really seeing that change where a lot of educators are like, no, what I really need to get my students engaged is they need to see themselves reflected in these stories. They need to see that themselves as a person is a character that is valid, that there are stories about, that there are good stories about, that other people are interested in their stories and their representation. And it's just so important to start this at the children's book age, because that you start forming your identity so early in life. And these children's books, you can't get there soon enough to just really provide windows into other lived experiences and mirrors into your own. Both have an incredible impact on students. I believe two of the quotes I highlighted specifically, one speaks to the power of children seeing themselves, and the other speaks to the power of exposing children to diverse stories at a young age so that they can navigate this diverse world in a much more kind and logical, thoughtful way as they go through life.
Absolutely. And I also think about, I'm looking at this one slide about final thoughts on book bans from educators, and how did you all curate a selection of curriculum providers who could make sure that children have diverse books in their lives, as you all formulated this study?
So we have a fantastic titles team that devotes their lives to studying every children's book that we offer on the First Book Marketplace. And we always make sure that the books that we're offering are exactly what our member educators need and have been vetted by our titles team, so that we know that they will be engaging and they will reach the right students and the right audience. So we're not in the business of creating curriculum necessarily, but one of the wonderful things that is coming out of this banned book study and this diverse book study is we're hearing a lot of educators say, I love this research, I love these findings. Now can you help me understand what to do with banned books in the classroom, what to do with diverse books? How do I teach with these books so that they are impactful, the most impactful they can be? So that's one of the spaces that First Book is going to look into filling. How can we take these banned books, these diverse books, and provide accompanying resources to really help educators use them to the maximum in their classroom, get the most juice out of them that they can. So we're not in the business of developing full curriculums, but we definitely provide support resources that help educators get the most out of a book.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to recognize the data you put in the final thoughts on book bans from educators slide. You said 43% of families can decide for themselves, but not for others. And so do you want to talk a little bit about deciding? I mean, all parents can decide what their kids can read. And so I think that that's like when we think about book bans and we think about the extremism that's happening in public education, we have to be cognizant that all parents do have the authority, most, I would say overwhelmingly most, have the decision to make a decision about what kind of book their child reads or does not read.
And that was a really important thing that educators wanted us to know. Just to be really clear, that 43% is that when we asked educators, what are your final, what else should First Book know about banned books? What are your final thoughts? 43% of those responses said, just remember that you have to keep the family in mind. The family opinion comes first. So we weren't saying that only 43% of educators think family opinions are important. That's not the stat. The stat is that just naturally came up for nearly half of educators, saying, don't forget parents. Like in our final thoughts, we're just saying we always have to keep parents top of mind. So that is something that our educators are very, very supportive of, that they might not necessarily agree with parents' decision to shield their child from a certain book or a certain topic, but they very much agree that parents have the final say over what their students can consume, but it just shouldn't impact the entire school in general.
Right.
And, I know I don't have a stat for this off the top of my head, but I know a large amount, the majority of book challenges come from a very small percentage of highly organized groups. So it's kind of like the squeakiest wheel, right? Like the loudest people are kind of getting the most attention, but they're the public schools serve entire communities, and there are tons of people within those spaces that just maybe aren't raising their hand to say, no, actually, we think books shouldn't be banned. So just keeping that balance in mind, always staying respectful of families and their beliefs and their values, that is number one most important, but that applies to everybody and all the different groups and families in a school.
Absolutely. And I also want to amplify really quickly that one of my favorite historical figures, living figures, is Oprah, and she amplified you all's work. And so do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was such a nice surprise. We did not know she was going to do that, but we were so super thrilled. She pulled a stat out of our diverse books impact study, the stat that said after adding diverse books to the classroom library, they increased reading time by classroom reading time by 4 hours for each week. So she pulled that stat out and spoke at the latest ALA conference, which I believe was talking specifically about banned books and talking about LeVar Burton and all his work. So yeah, that was just a really wonderful surprise. She nailed it too. She said the stat exactly correctly. She had, beautiful context around it. So we're really honored and thrilled that she caught wind of our study.
Well, I'm a big fan of LeVar Burton, so I'm always going to be a fan of reading Rainbow and all the things. And so I know we only have 11 minutes left. I don't think we have many questions from the chat, but I do want to talk to you about one more thing before we end. What would you say is the biggest impact that you've had from creating this study and that you've seen from communities and that parents day to day can do? Like what action can we take once a week, once a month, once a year to make sure that our children have diverse and even banned books, because most diverse books are banned. And so what would you say are the actions that we should take to um, make our communities more diverse and just accessible to these type of texts?
Yeah, this is one of the big questions that usually follows these studies, and it's such an important one. My first initial thought is always to speak up. Right now, the only people speaking up are the people that want the books challenged and want the books banned, and that's why they're getting the attention. If everyone that didn't believe in banned books and didn't want books taken from libraries and schools, if everyone in those groups spoke up, then the noise would probably be much louder, and you would see that the group that is trying to ban and challenge is not as big and mighty as it might sound like they are. So my first response is always just to speak up on the pro side, be pro banned books, and let's, if we all start making that noise, then that's when the waves will come.
Well, thank you so much, Jules. I think you've provided us with a wealth of information. And I know it got a little wonky there for some of the research for some of us that were on the call, because I was just like, oh, qualitative, quantitative, all the things, the charts, the stuff. But you've definitely given us a robust perspective on what we can do and where we are and thinking about diverse books for kids, and not only just kids, but people who are just interested in learning about different communities and identities and experiences. And so we thank you so much. I know we've had a small audience today, but we did record this. So this will be, with your permission, be on our YouTube, and you can use it as well. And we want to continue to support your efforts. And so anybody from the audience that wants to say anything in our last couple of minutes here. I think we've got 9 minutes reserved, but I definitely want to give people the opportunity to say a little something if they so choose to, and we want to keep it as respectful as possible.
And you can always feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions. I've answered tons of questions from audience members post study, so don't worry about that. I'm happy to answer questions via email too.
Cool. Well, without further ado, Jules, we are so glad that you've been a part of our community, and we are a community of over 500,000 women working to fight extremism, especially in public schools, and we are fighting back against book bans. And we want, like in Illinois, for instance, one of my good friends, State Senator Mike Simmons, proposed legislation this year even that ban book banning. So you can't ban books in Illinois anymore. Governor Pritzker signed that into law. And so I'm so glad that Mike was able to do that, and know that there is a framework. There is opportunities for us to do that in other states too. It might be more of an uphill battle in other states than Illinois, but just know that we have to make sure that folks read diverse books, and it can be a variety of identities and topics, because we all live intersectional lives. Nobody leads one issue life. Everybody has intersections, and everybody's dealing with something. And so we have to make sure that our children and even adults in our life are reading them. And so thank you so much, Jules, and I'll bid adieu.
Thank you all.